Hey y'all, my name is Pastor Ethan, and I serve as the pastor here at Crawford Road Baptist Church. I'm so thankful you found this video. Whether you're about to watch a sermon or a Bible study, I'm so glad that you would like to study God's Word with us. I do want to say that as important as it is to be studying and using online videos, it's even more important to be growing in your faith connected to a local church. So please make sure to stay plugged into your local church, or join us on Sunday morning at 10:30 if you don't already have a local church. But don't let a video like this make you think that it's a replacement for gathered worship. That is really important. But I do hope that this video will benefit you and help you grow in your faith. God bless, and thank you for watching.
Okay, there we go. Tonight, the opening question for everybody is this. It would be, what do gnats and feminism have in common? What do gnats and feminism have in common? We hate to go. They both make a lot of incessant whining. Very, very good first answer. I didn't say feminine as in females, though. When I connect whining, specifically feminism. So that mindset, that feminism of the culture. Just to clear myself of any misquotations that I said women whine. That is not what I said. Just so that's clear for the record. But gnats and feminism, what do those two things have in common? Anybody else have any ideas? Everyone's like, I don't know. After the whining thing, I'm done. Yep. Definitely. The thing that comes to my mind, although there's probably more than one, is that they both lack true power. They both lack true power. And we're going to get more into that tonight, because tonight the plague that we're going to study from Exodus is plague 3. And we're actually going to end up seeing how the plague of gnats has something to teach us about a lot of things in our culture. Feminism is one of those things that we'll end up looking at. And so that's why I ask this question. But if you want to open up your Bibles to Exodus 8, that's where we'll be. And before we can start talking too much about feminism, we got to first start off by talking about gnats. So go to your Bibles in Exodus 8, verse 16. That's where we find the plague of gnats written out. And as you're turning there, just a quick review for everything that we've been studying. So as we've been looking at these plagues, we've been looking at the fact that even though there's 10 separate events, 10 plagues that God sends on the nation of Egypt, there's really one overarching theme. God is communicating the message both to the Egyptians, the Israelites, and honestly, everyone else who's watching. Whether contemporaries of the day in other nations or us today in the modern world. God is sending the clear message that He alone is worthy of worship. So all of these plagues, the theme of them is God saying that He alone is worthy of worship. So when we look at each plague, what each plague is doing is showing us one reason among many, there's more than 10, but one reason why God is worthy of worship. And in the first plague with the water in the Nile being turned to blood, we saw that God is worthy of worship because trusting and obeying Him leads to life. And when you don't trust and obey Him, that leads to judgment, both on a personal level and on a group level when you think about families, communities, nations. And then the second plague last week with frogs, we saw that plague teaches us that God alone, Yahweh alone, is worthy of worship because He's the author and sustainer of life. He made us and He sustains us, and not only us, but all life. It all comes from Him. That's why He alone is worthy of worship. And the main idea for tonight that we see from the plague of gnats is that Yahweh alone is worthy of worship because He is all-powerful. Yahweh alone is worthy of all worship because He is all-powerful. And so the context of tonight and the theme for tonight is we're going to be looking at power. Who has the real power, the true power? And that's what we find in Exodus. So we'll start off by just reading these verses together. It's just a shorter chunk tonight, verses 16 through 19. Here's what Exodus 8 says. Then Yahweh said to Moses, "Tell Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the land, and it will become gnats throughout the land of Egypt." Now remember, Egypt is primarily a desert. You've got the Nile River that runs from top to bottom. If you're looking on the map, if you start on the western border and you go about 3/4 of the way over, that's where the Nile River sits, and it goes from top to bottom. But the nation's pretty big, and most of it is a desert. So the dust of the land is not just one guy whose backyard doesn't have a lot of grass. You're looking at a nation that is primarily desert. And so for all of the dust of the land to become gnats is a very big deal when you think about an entire desert worth of dust. And Moses and Aaron did this in verse 17. Aaron stretched out his hand with his staff, and when he struck the dust of the land, gnats were on the people and animals. All the dust of the land became gnats throughout the land of Egypt. The magicians tried to produce gnats using their occult practices, their magic, but they couldn't. The gnats remained on the people and animals. "This is the finger of God," the magicians said to Pharaoh. But Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not listen to them, as Yahweh had said. So here in that short set of verses, we see this plague of gnats come on the Egyptians. And the main idea that we can see from this is that Yahweh alone is worthy of worship because he is all-powerful. Now, to understand why this has anything to do with God's power, we got to take attention. We got to pay attention to a few things that are just worth observing. So, Moses and Aaron, after the frog incident, we don't know how much time has passed. At the end of the water in the Nile being turned to blood, we see that there were 7 days that went by before the frogs came. We don't know how much time went by in between the frogs and the gnats. It was probably a shorter period of time than a longer one, but God didn't tell us the exact number of days. But as this happens, Moses and Aaron go back to Pharaoh. Once again, it's this message of, hey, let my people go. And Pharaoh doesn't. So Moses and Aaron, they're working together. Remember, Moses had a speech impediment, some kind of stutter. He was really sensitive about it. And so God let Aaron be his mouthpiece, which is why they're working together here. Aaron reaches out his staff, and the next judgment comes, and that judgment is all the dust of the land turning into gnats. Now, in the first two plagues, the magicians tried and succeeded in some ways to replicate the plagues. They were able to turn the water of the Nile into blood, and they were able to produce more frogs. They couldn't turn the water back into water. They couldn't go, hey, here's blood, let's make it water again. And they couldn't get the frogs to go away, but in some measure, they could at least halfway replicate what God was doing. This plague is different because this time they can't, not only can they not reverse it, but they can't even generate more gnats like what God did. So that results in them turning to Pharaoh and saying, man, we don't know. We got nothing for you. We can't help. And that's a pretty big deal. So that's kind of the flow of everything with the plague. And a couple of the other things that are worth remembering. In the introduction lesson, if you remember, we talked about how the plagues are in groups of 3. So there's 10 plagues, and the 10th plague kind of stands on its own. But the first 3 plagues are about something that's irritating to the Egyptians. And then the next 3 plagues up the ante and destruction starts to come. And then the last, technically 4, but the last 3 plagues are about death. And so we are in a spot where this is the last plague that's only irritating. Now, we've seen that your entire water source being turned to blood, and a bunch of frogs overtaking your land, and then now gnats. If this is just irritation, you can imagine what is destruction if this is only irritation. Now, we don't know exactly what kind of insects actually were all over the people. The Hebrew word that gets used here, there's a lot of debate on what exactly kind of insect it is. And if you Google gnat today, you see a little thing that's like a baby fly, and they buzz around in the summer when it's all humid and you're swatting at them all the time. It could have been that. It's also possible that it was a mosquito of some kind. And there are also some Hebrew Bible scholars that think that maybe it was lice. At any rate, whatever kind of tiny, annoying insect it was, the text is very clear to say that they weren't just sort of flying around in the air. They were on the people. They were on the animals. So whether it was lice or a mosquito or a normal gnat, you can imagine an infestation so big that it's not just like you need a fly swatter, but that they're crawling all over you and you can't get them off no matter what you do. Because you're in a desert and all of a sudden all of the sand just became gnats. And so there's just these insects everywhere, all over. All of the animals, all of the people. Interestingly, the crops aren't affected yet. There's more to come on that later with other plagues. But this is primarily on the people and the animals. And so you can just imagine bugs being all over you for who knows how much time, because the scriptures don't say how long this plague lasted. It's possible that this plague overlapped with some of the other ones. So, pretty gross picture, but you can just imagine them crawling all over you, biting you, and there's nothing you can do. When you kill one, 10 more pop up, and so you're just stuck with this disgusting insect infestation. Now, once again, the magicians, they can't replicate what God did. They lose the ability to produce this. Now, the magicians, does anybody remember? Here's your pop quiz for the night. Who were the magicians? Because we're not talking about the guy that you hire for a 5-year-old's birthday party that has a bunny and a top hat. That's not what we're talking about. So does anybody remember who were these magicians? We talked about them a lot in the first plague.
Priests of the Egyptian gods.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
They had sold their souls so they could get their powers from the demons.
Absolutely. Yep, they were the priests of all of the false gods. Something that we have to keep in mind as we read here in Exodus and honestly all of the scriptures is that Yahweh, God, He's the one true God. He's the creator of all things and therefore the only one worthy of worship. But when we read in the scriptures about other people worshiping other gods, and you see a lowercase g instead of a capital G, it's not that they were fake. They were false gods, meaning they weren't worthy of worship. But false and fake aren't the same thing. There were real spiritual beings, demons, that were trying to lead the Egyptians and every other ancient culture and our cultures today astray, away from worshiping God. And in order to do that, they used many means of deception. And one of them was this offer. Hey, if you sell your soul to us, we will endow you with more power than anybody else. And it will be power that looks magical, meaning a man couldn't just be really good with technology and build something to replicate it. I mean, we're not talking about the Wizard of Oz who can just outsmart people and make it look fancy. This was truly something that was an amount of power that humans wouldn't have on our own. Hey, if you sell your soul to me, I can give you this. And so you lead other people to worship me, and I will help you be powerful. And they'll think that I'm worthy of worship. That's how it worked. And so these priests then were very important in Egyptian society. And it would have been true, and it was true, in all of the other ancient cultures as well. The priests were not necessarily the politicians per se, but they also had a place in politics, and they had a place in religion. They had a place of culturally being elite. So you could compare them today to other people who in our culture are cultural elites. And there's a lot of different categories you could probably put in. You know, you could look at famous entertainers, whether that's an athlete or a music star or someone who's got like a YouTube channel that a bunch of people watch the videos for. Famous lawyers and politicians that got wealthy doing something, and so maybe if they're not the head of a law firm or currently holding an office, they still pull a lot of strings. Rich people that just pay for stuff and so they can get whatever they want. And big companies that just seem to sort of have a monopoly on everything. You could think of Taylor Swift. You could think of Bill and Hillary Clinton. You could think of LeBron James. You could think of Google. These things that just have this inordinate amount of power. Nobody elected them. Nobody really gave them power. And yet the influence is just pervasive in society. That's what these priests were. They were pervasive in all of society. And so, for them, setting culture, setting pace, setting how people were supposed to behave, for them to not be able to replicate this would have been something that would have caused everyone in Egypt a lot of panic. Because they're looking around and thinking, well, these are the guys that are connected to the gods. And if they can't stop this, then what are we going to do? And it's interesting because they look at Moses, or they look at Pharaoh, these magicians, and they're like, all right, dude, this is the finger of God. This is the finger of God. And that's an expression that's used to describe God's power. So in Exodus 31:18, when God gives Moses the Ten Commandments and he writes them on the stone tablets, Exodus 31:18 says that it was God's finger that put the commands on the stone tablets. So that phrase is an expression for the power and the might of God. And so what these magicians are doing is they're looking at Pharaoh and they're saying, hey, we thought Moses and Aaron were like us. We thought that they were guys who sold their soul to this deity named Yahweh, and that he was just a little bit stronger than some of our deities. But if we tried hard enough or offered enough sacrifices, maybe our deities could beat Yahweh. That's what we thought was going on. What's actually happening is that Yahweh himself is sending these plagues. They're looking and they're saying, hey, this is not just some other God's magician. This is a deity. The God himself is doing this. And so we can't compete because we don't have that much power. We're toast here. We got nothing. Now, Pharaoh, who in the Egyptian way of thinking wasn't just a political leader, but was also a god himself, was descended from the gods, still didn't listen. He still hardens his heart. He says, fine. It doesn't matter that you guys can't produce this. I'm still not going to bow my knee. I'm still not going to say that, this God can beat me out. A lot of pride going on. Like I said at the beginning, there's no real indication that when this stopped. So we don't know exactly when this plague stopped, and it might have been going on even as other plagues were occurring. So before we go to the next part of the lesson, we got to kind of think through why are gnats a judgment. I mean, obviously it would be terrible to have an insect infestation, but why gnats and why not something else? What other observations? When you look at the text and you see it, since we're in a pretty confined space, we'll do one big group activity instead of having you break up into smaller groups like we've done in the sanctuary the past couple weeks. But I want to hear from you. What do you see from this text? What pops out to you from the verses? What stands out? Yes, Marvin.
It seems to me this is an exponentially greater plague because it is an actual act of creation. Because something inanimate like dust is being turned into a living creature.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas before, water is being turned into blood, or no frogs are coming out of the water. This is not an act of creation.
Yeah, this is true transformation, true power. Absolutely, different level. What else? What else do you all see from this that stands out? Yep. Yeah, Moses and Aaron obeyed. And that's a very stark contrast. Moses is the author of Exodus, and I think Moses wrote it like that on purpose, not to, paint himself out as awesome. He includes a lot of stuff about himself that doesn't paint a great picture. So, you can't accuse Moses of not being humble. But I think God had him record that to say, hey, I want your actions and Aaron's actions to be compared to Pharaoh's. Because there's this lesson to learn about, hey, when we worship God, something beautiful many beautiful things are occurring. But one of the cool things about God is that what glorifies him is also good for us. His glory and our good go hand in hand. And so him doing that, him saying, hey, worship me, follow me, obey me, trust me, unlike all these other gods who you have to give and give and give, and then they take and take and take and never give you anything back, God always blesses his people. And that contrast is really huge.
I got out of this. God does what he says he's going to do.
Oh, yeah. God's consistent and keeps his word.
And the other thing that seems to be missing here is the Israelite people. Did they get added to? Or?
So the text doesn't differentiate yet. You know, the farther you get into the plagues, you start to see God separating out and it not affecting Israel in the same way. Right here in this text, it doesn't really indicate one way or the other. So it's possible that to some degree they were affected. I mean, all of the dust. I mean, I'm sure there was still some dust left on the ground. Probably a bit hyperbolic, but I'm sure Moses wasn't kidding at the same time with all that dust. No doubt they had to have been in some ways affected. I don't think they could have not seen the gnats. But I think it's safe to say, based off of how the rest of the plagues unfold, that whatever effect this had on Israel, it would have certainly had an exponentially greater effect on the Egyptian people.
Well, from what I read, they said where the Israelites were down in Goshen, they didn't experience this.
Yeah, they get a lot of separation. They get a lot of separation from a lot of these plagues. This one, particularly about the gnats, it's so short that it doesn't really give us a lot of detail about sort of what was going on around it. But God's hand with his people is a good lesson too, because it reminds us that sometimes when God's judgment comes on a society, a community, his people feel part of the effect, but they don't necessarily get completely run over. In fact, he always keeps us. And I think it's an important lesson to remember that God keeping his people safe doesn't mean that we won't ever experience some of the things that go on in terms of judgment. We still feel trial, we still feel tribulation. If he sends a judgment of, say, something like a famine, well, we might have an issue where we're also struggling at Walmart to get some groceries. But what we often find is that, hey, someone else at my church had groceries and I ended up eating and we were okay. And a lot of other people had issues, but, God takes care of his people. And even though sometimes the effects of his judgment are general in the world, his people are always safe. And at the end of the day, good to go. Because he's always got his hand on us. But I think sometimes he lets us experience a little bit. Like, say, if the gnats were there and on them as a lesson. Because he's reminding us, hey, I need you to taste it just a little bit so that you're a little bit uncomfortable and you recognize that if you really do reject me, this gets a lot worse. Don't think that you're special. Like, oh, this plague didn't come on me because I'm amazing. No, this plague didn't come on you because I, as your God, am amazing. You need to keep trusting me. You need to keep following me. And I think the same is true for us as his people, where he's calling us in our day to say, hey, as you see judgment in society, remember that you don't want that, which is why you need to keep trusting in me. Now, as we kind of keep rolling through this story, the next thing that we've got to ask, that we asked about the first two plagues, and we'll ask about all of them, is this question of why. Why gnats? God could have chosen anything. He's, hey, I'm going to do 10 plagues, and he could have picked anything. And so with all of them, we have to say, why this particular one? Why gnats out of everything else that could have been the case? God could have sent crazy lightning bolts or done any number of things, but he chose gnats. So I've got some history from Egypt that I think helps explain that. But before I go over it, why do you think that gnats were the plague? Why is that, after we've learned the story, why is that a judgment from God?
Is it possible? Now, I've heard this before, that at least most of these plagues, maybe all of them, had something to do with gods and goddesses of that Egyptian culture. Mm-hmm. Some way of, I don't know what you would call it, turning the table against them, using their own so-called gods.
Absolutely.
That what they worship now turned against them.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's totally what's at play here. Oh, for sure. Yeah.
I heard somebody say it right then.
Yes.
One me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I've done a deep dive over the last couple of weeks, and I'm sure I'm not done yet, on Egyptian mythology. And it's really weird. When you rip off and you avoid the truth, it's just ridiculous. You stick to the Bible is the main point. That's what's true. And it's what makes the most sense. But in the way that the Egyptians conceived of the world, and the way they thought about the world, instead of what we know to be true, that Yahweh God created the heavens and the earth, and he did so in 6 days, they conceived of the world as having been created by two different gods. The god Geb, who was the earth god, and his wife Nut, who was the goddess of the sky. So earth and sky coming together, having children, and those children being gods, and all kinds of crazy story about different people kill people and leads to death and crying and pain and tears and blood and stuff turned into humans, and it's ridiculous. But the point here is that Geb, the earth god of Egypt, was worshipped and revered because everybody thought he was one of the main creator gods of everything. But he was the god of the earth. And so when you read the scripture and you say that Aaron touched the dust of the earth, and it's the dust of the earth that became gnats, there's a connection there right off the bat to, hey, there's one creator, and it kind of ties into the frog thing of God being the author of life that we talked about last week. Hey, there's one. We think creation happened this way, and it was this God, and we give him credit. But really, look what happened. His domain just got wrecked, and he couldn't do anything about it. And then that God had multiple sons, some of whom are more famous. And if you've ever watched a movie with Egyptian archaeology and Indiana Jones or whatever, you might have heard of them. Gods like Osiris. But Geb had one son whose name was Set. And Set was a god of war and chaos and infertility and the god of the desert. And in Egyptian mythology, he goes up and down. Sometimes he's a good guy, sometimes he's a bad guy. We know that all of these gods were demons, so they're all bad guys all of the time. But the way the Egyptians would have thought of them, he was a bit of an anti-hero. Sometimes he did good stuff, sometimes he did bad stuff. But this god, Set, was the god of the desert. And so when you think about, the god of the desert, and then all of the dust and the sand in the desert is what gets turned into the gnats, as Egyptians are worshiping these gods, and these gods have these magicians who've, hey, you sold your soul to me, here's all this power. What God is clearly communicating is that he's the God who has all the power. And power is such a big deal here because the God of the desert can't control the sand, and he's also the God of chaos, the God of war. And what do you associate with war? Power. Who wins a war? The strongest army. Who controls chaos? Well, a guy who's stronger than chaos. Hence the god Set. But what you look at is you say, well, if the God of chaos can't stop this, if the God of war can't stop this, who can? And all of a sudden you have to say, well, clearly someone is better than Set. And who is that? Well, it's Yahweh, the one true God who made everyone and everything. And Set being a rebellious fallen angel, a demon, and God even made those angels. I mean, they fell, they rebelled, but God's the creator of all things. And so what he's saying to Egypt is, the people that you think have the power don't have the power. I have the power. The people that you think are in control and can influence things, they don't have as much control as you think they do. They don't have as much influence as you think they do. And that's the big thing that comes from this plague, is that the priests can't keep up. And if they can't keep up, then ultimately that's a reflection on the God that they sold their soul to. Because they said, hey, well, here's my soul, give me the power. And if they can't keep up, it means the God who's giving them power is a bad power source. He doesn't have enough juice to keep competing. And then you got to say, well, why would I worship someone who can't do anything, who doesn't have any power? Why would I follow someone without power? And God's clearly saying, because you shouldn't worship false gods. You shouldn't worship demons anyway. I'm the creator of heaven and earth. You should worship me. I'm the one who has all of the power. You should worship me. Now, I read something, and I don't know how much it connects, but it's cool enough to mention. And you can go do a deep dive on Egyptian mythology and talk to me about it. But last week, the frog goddess that God judged, her name was Heket. and she was the fertility goddess. So Set, the god judged this week, is the infertility god. Last week, the fertility goddess was judged. And she's also potentially the Greek goddess of magic and a bunch of other junk, is called Hecate. And there's a bunch of people who've connected the names and said there's a good chance that the same false gods were worshipped by both the Egyptians and the Greeks, which makes a lot of sense. Satan's trying to deceive everyone, goes to a different culture, uses a different name, and yet same lie to lead people astray. But that Hecate was the goddess in Greek of magic. And if she really is connected to Hecate from last week, then what that means is that the moment that God killed the magician or the goddess of magic, the magicians stopped being able to do anything. So if you kind of follow that flow and you look at all of these things, there's this message where God destroys the goddess of magic, and then all of a sudden the magicians are like, well, I guess we better get a top hat and a bunny and see if a 5-year-old will book us for his birthday party, because that's all we got left, guys. Sorry. Now, mythology's weird, and you got to trace cultural stuff, and I don't know how strong of a connection there is, but I thought that was interesting. That I think it shows us at one level, one thing is certain. Satan's not super original. He just tells the same lie, and he picks it up and he goes to different people, and he has the same framework for lies. So when you pull the hood back underneath all the religions of the world that aren't what God has revealed in the Bible, it looks different on the surface, different names and different rituals and traditions. But when you actually think about what are these false gods doing and what do their rituals and traditions do, they all do the same thing. It's all leading people astray from God. It's all, hey, I'll give you everything and maybe you'll give me something, which is the opposite of the gospel. The gospel is God saying, I gave you everything and then you rebelled. It's just for me to judge you, but also I'll give myself up for you. And I'll give everything for you. You don't have to give everything for me. I'll give everything for you and save you. Instead of the message that comes from these false gods that says, give everything up to me, I'll suck you dry, and then even though I promised power, I'm not going to deliver anything. And that message is important because God is telling the Israelites, hey, you see this judgment happening to the Egyptians, that's why you shouldn't worship them. I mean, you got to remember, the Israelites lived in Egypt for 400 years. That's way longer than America has been a country. And so culturally, a lot, no doubt, had seeped into the Israelites' minds on the way they thought about the world. And God's clearly saying, no. You worship me, and here's why. Yeah.
That's it. The reason the guy I listened to, they were there for 400 years. They knew nothing much of Yahweh. There was no prophets, no priests, temple, no sacrifice, no Moses. They knew they were Jews, that's about it.
Yeah.
They knew about the gods of the Egyptians much more than about Yahweh. Much. And so part of it may have been why they experienced some of these plagues is to say, look, once God took it away, who's really got the power?
Mm-hmm.
But we noticed that when they went to the desert and Aaron produced that calf and said, jumped out of the fire, they went right back to what they.
It's a lesson that unfortunately the Israelites, some of them were faithful, but an awful lot of them didn't learn all the way. And it's easy for us to judge them, but we got to look at our culture and we got to say, hey, you know what? Really, the reality is, as we study these things, it's easy, arrogantly, to say, those dumb ancient people, we wouldn't have done that. We know better. Now, for those of us who are on this side of the cross, who've been saved by Jesus and God the Holy Spirit indwells us, obviously we're going to make some different choices because God the Holy Spirit indwells us. He's guiding us and leading us to help us be more like Jesus. But if we think about ourselves before we got saved, we have to just think, I was a product of the culture too. Maybe a different culture, depending on my family background and the friends I had and the things I was into. Different sins may have been my struggle, but before we got saved, we were all a product of the culture that we came out of. And that culture is still around us today and has shaped through education and entertainment and our friends and our family and all kinds of stuff. It's shaped the way that we think more than we think it has. And so what God was doing for them back in Exodus and us now is he's doing what Romans 12 says. He's transforming us by the renewing of our minds. He's reshaping and rewiring the way that we think and perceive the world, because apart from Christ, we don't perceive the world the right way. We perceive it through the lens of sin and rebellion, led astray by these very same demons that led Egypt astray. And that ties into our connection today with today's culture. It starts to get us back into the question from the beginning about what do Gnats and feminism have in common. Answer: both of them lack real power. Because you see, the whole lesson is about the fact that Yahweh alone is worthy of worship because he's all powerful. And so then we have to ask ourselves the question, if we learn about Yahweh's power by watching how unpowerful these magicians in Egypt were, who are the magicians of our day? The cultural elite type people that influence society. Now, I gave a few examples, but before I tie Gnats and feminism together, do you guys have any other examples? Who are the magicians of our culture? Who are the elite people that might not be elected politicians, but still have an overabundance of influence in the culture and the way that everybody thinks and acts? Yes, ma'am.
Some of these singers and football players, and all these people, they have a lot of power too. Whatever they're doing, all these kids want to get what they're wearing, the shoes.
Yep. Everybody wants Travis Kelce's haircut.
Yeah. I think possibly false teachers or preachers.
Uh-huh.
They influence,
Oh, yeah.
unfortunately, those who need to be right, not just culture.
And social media is an easy way to leverage your voice over an even larger audience than... Yeah. Yeah, a lot of people in the news, right? News potentially, maybe, hopefully used to be unbiased. You can't say that anymore. Yeah, everybody's got an angle, and you got to ask what the angle is when you're reading the news article. Yeah, there's all these examples and so many more that we could give. But I think it's easy for us to think about the famous people. You know, the pop stars and the politicians and the people that are in the news and in media and make movies and stuff about them. And so it's easy to kind of know about them. The reason that feminism is the tie-in here is because it is a lie that Satan has used to shape generations of people, women and men, to think a certain way about the world that's just not true. In our day and age, instead of having the false gods be literal gods, hey, that guy's set and there's an idol of him and I'm going to go sell my soul to him, Satan tricks us into thinking that our smarts are the way that we've arrived. And so we end up worshiping ourselves. The demons tell us the same lies, but we worship ourselves. We think, we don't worship gods and goddesses of fertility, except that next month is dedicated to sexual perversion and rainbow flags are going to be everywhere. We don't worship, whatever gods of creation, except that you have to trust the science, and you're a stupid, dumb idiot if you don't trust the science. And so on and so forth. When you start to look at it, you're like, underneath the hood of a lot of the stuff in the culture is the same lies that Satan tries to make us think because we have modern technology. We're smarter and we're just as dumb as everybody else was, and we need Jesus just as much. So, feminism is one of these things that's come. You see, God said in Genesis that man was man and woman was woman. And man and woman are supposed to get married, one to one, and start a family. And the family was the foundational building block of community, and community was the foundational building block of the state, and the state was the foundational building block of the world. And so you start with the family, and you build out to get the culture, and you fill the world like God told Adam and Eve to do. Satan didn't give Adam and Eve the piece of fruit in Genesis because he wanted them to succeed. He doesn't give a rip about humanity. He hates our guts. The reason he tempted Eve was because he knew God would have death as the punishment. He wants God's job. And so if he can kill the image bearer, the special crowning jewel of God's creation, then he can remove the competition and get to God's throne faster. Or at least that's what he thought. And so he tempts Eve. Hey, did God really say? And look, I'm really great. And here's an apple, and it's going to be wonderful. You'll have a ton of good things. Bite, actually, death. That's what comes. And Satan's been attacking the family ever since. Because one of the biggest threats to Satan is a godly mom and a godly dad who get married and go to church and raise their kids to love and follow Jesus. And when those kids get saved, they live life in this culture in a way that honors Jesus, and they try to do the exact same thing. If you can fill the world with people who follow God's plan, then the kingdom of God expands. Satan hates that, and so what does he do? Well, if I can get families to not form, then society can fall apart. And that's why every time you look at a society that crumbles, you see an attack on gender and sexuality in the family. Because if Satan can destroy the building block and cut your knees out from under you, everything falls down. And so, feminism comes into that right around the turn from the 1800s into the 1900s. When the same time culturally in the West, what do you see? Well, you see cars are right around the corner of getting made. You have just had the Industrial Revolution that's changed people who farmed for generations. People are starting to move to cities and get different jobs. Society is really starting to change. And so Satan says, hey, what a great opportunity when society in the West is at a turning point to put a hook in and try to pull the thing down and tank it. Let's start to attack the family. Now, feminism, I'm going to give you a brief history lesson. Bear with me, it's important, and you'll see why in a second. It starts around the 1900s, and there's 4 different waves of feminism that historians talk about the movement of feminism in. And the first wave started in the early 1900s, and it sounded good at first. There were things like, hey, there's partiality in voting. Only men can vote. Women need to have suffrage. And you look and you think, well, yeah, I mean, women should vote, right? I mean, we should probably let women vote, so maybe that one's a good thing, or other things like that. But baked into the cake from the beginning was this concept. It was not, hey, did you know that in the beginning God made man and woman to be equal in value, dignity, and worth, but different in their role? And so what we need to do is represent that in society by doing things like let women vote. That's not what the movement said. Why do women need to vote? Well, women need to vote because men have oppressed women, and women need to rise up and throw off that oppression and start to be the equal and maybe even more dominant force we know we can be if these just oafish men would get out of the way. Let us vote. Let us do other things. So you see Satan take a good thing and flip it for a bad purpose. And over time, what happens is that idea starts to get baked into what parents teach kids and society teaches kids. Because in the early 1900s, the other thing that's starting to happen is education goes from Little House on the Prairie schoolhouses to an institutionalized system controlled by the state, where every single classroom in every single part of the country has the same standardized curriculum for everything. How can we mass market things that aren't true and take advantage of something excellent like education, which everybody should have? So Satan begins to flip that. And the lie the whole time is, did God really say? Did God really say that men and women are different? That God made men to be men and women to be women? Are you sure? I'm pretty sure that women can do everything a man can do. Are you sure that's what God said? And so that slowly starts to get baked in. And then around the 60s and 70s, you see the second wave of feminism pop up. And it's all about sexual freedom and equality in the workplace. And once again, you think, well, I mean, I guess if a woman is at work, she shouldn't be like, oh, you don't get as much money just because you're a woman. You're like, yeah, that seems a little unfair, right? If 2 people are doing the same job, equal pay feels like it's a good idea. Once again, Satan takes something and flips it and says, hey, it's not about let's be fair because God is just and fair. It's about, well, there's something here. I need to do everything a man can do. If I'm a woman, I can do what a man can do better. Or I could do it better than a man. And then I also, if I'm going to have this dominance, if I'm going to prove myself in the workplace, if I'm going to do these things, what do I need? I need sexual freedom, because the children that God says are a blessing, they pull me down. If I have to be a wife and a mom, I can't dominate men in the workforce. And so I have to be able to be free from the shackles of children. And children are the natural result of sex. And so I need my sexual freedom. And you start to see things like Roe versus Wade, where, hey, I don't want to be shackled by kids, I'm going to kill them. Let's make abortion legal so that I can kill the kids and I'm not shackled by all of this stuff. Traditional gender roles and what the Bible says about men and women don't matter. What matters is me proving that I'm awesome. And so that bakes into the cake for another few generations. And then you get into the 1990s and early 2000s, and you see this strong theme of ditching what God says about men and women and doing whatever we want to do. And it wasn't just about anymore, hey, here are men, here are women, let's have women get up to this equal footing. Now, it's about the fact that women should be able to just go above men. Women should be able to throw off all of the oppression. But it's interesting because what starts to happen is, you know what? If a man can be promiscuous and not get in trouble, he can write a country song about how many girlfriends he's had and everybody listens to it and it becomes a Billboard chart topper. Why can't I be promiscuous? Why am I given a scarlet letter A for being promiscuous, but a man isn't? I shouldn't be able to have that. And now you would think, hey, maybe all of us stop being promiscuous and just start honoring the Lord with our sexuality. But instead, it's, no. If a man can get away with all of any kind of sin, I want to get away with it too. And all of a sudden, that starts to flow out of this. And you start to see the L and the G and the B of the acronym. There's so many letters, I can't even keep up with it. Because all of a sudden it's like, who even needs a man? What if I want my sexual partner to be a woman? Why can't I be a lesbian? I don't need a man. And I'll prove it to you by never marrying one. I'm going to marry a woman instead. Because she can fulfill me more than a man can. And once again, all of this ties back to, here's what God said is good and right and true. Let's reject all of it, and that leads to freedom. The whole time, what's being peddled to women is this lie. If you do the opposite of what God said you're designed to do, you'll have power. Feminism is, hey, let's empower women. But you know who wants to empower women is the Lord. That's why he made you the way he did and gave you everything in the scriptures that it says about womanhood. And so what did Satan do? Don't listen to God. Did he really say? No, you need all of these other things. That's how you become empowered. And then you get to where we are today, where nobody can even define a woman anymore. Nobody even knows what a woman is. All the way up to Supreme Court justices who are like, what's a woman? I don't know, bro. It depends on who you ask. Straight up, Ketanji Brown Jackson's answer during her confirmation hearings. I don't know what a woman is. And to where you get to this point where what started out as, hey, women should be treated fairly, and everyone thinks, yeah, they should. You end up with now trans women who are actually men are trying to enter women's spaces, whether it be restrooms or locker rooms or sports or the workplace. Why? Because they're looking and thinking, well, if everybody hates dudes all the time, why don't we just say that we're women? Their whole argument was, you don't get to define me, so cool. If I hook on to that and say I'm a woman, then what do you have? You have Time Magazine giving people who are men the Woman of the Year award. You have Dove having, or Hershey during Women's History Month, her story, and then it's a dude. And you're like, that's so not a girl. I think I might not want to eat a Hershey bar for a while. Like, all of these things happen, and you begin to see this shift where just like gnats got on animals and humans, and all of a sudden you're covered and infested, and you're so far away from everything that God said was good. You get a lie, and everything else pulls you away from it. Now, I know that was a long history lesson, a long sort of application section, but I had to walk you through each stage of how feminism is developed, at least at a highlighted kind of level, to show you that that's how Satan works. In our modern world, we want to think magicians don't exist anymore. Wrong. They're still there, and you can see it in every commercial and in every song and in every movie. It's all right there. Here's what God said. Reject it. Do something else. And if you do, you'll be empowered. But the question that we have to look at and say, is society better off 100 years later? Or is society worse? Where are we as a society? Is it better off? And I don't think anybody who's thinking clearly would say, you know what? We're better off now that men can say they're women and go into a 13-year-old girl's locker room and shower with her. Right? That's not good. That's evil and demonic, but that's where our culture is because we bought the lie. We bought the lie. Hey, I'm not going to structure my life and my family the way God said. I'm going to structure my life and my family the way that I want. Boom. Just like gnats are all over you, the sin and the mess and the grossness is all over you. And so for our culture today, I mean, the thing we've got to do is just start to recognize, hey, this is a lie. This is wrong. There's no power. The empowerment of women through feminism is this lie that says, hey, sell your soul to me and you'll be good to go. And then what happens? You get our culture. And you get the mess. And you get the junk that we're in. And we have to say, actually, there's real power, but it's in the Lord who made you and knows you and loves you and has a design and a plan for your life because he literally knit you together in your mother's womb on purpose to be who you are, to follow the plan for your life that he made because he's good. And whatever glorifies him is also really good for you. But will you listen? You know, the other interesting thing about how this is played out is that have you noticed that there's a generation or two from 25 or so down of young men who are angry? Have you noticed that in the news, if you pay attention to stories, if you watch social media? There's an entire generation of young men that are angry because their whole life they've been told, you're worthless, you're stupid, you're dumb. Women are better than you. This feminism movement that used to be about, hey, maybe some things that aren't quite fair should be fair has completely flipped the script. And now there's people on social media. You guys may or may not know this name, but there's a guy named Andrew Tate who's a complete not good person. He's all over the news. He's all over social media. And he womanizes and beats on people and does all kinds of bad stuff. And young men follow that dude in droves. They follow his workout program. They follow his diet. They buy the cars and the clothes that he buys. Why? Because Satan is happy to play both ends and flip. Wherever there's anger and dissatisfaction, he's happy to come in and pull it in. So then for us, with the gospel, we have the ability to say, hey, you know what's powerful is a church like Crawford Road preaching the gospel and telling people you are full of dignity and worth and value because God made you. And if you're a man, it's good because he made men to be men. And if you're a woman, it's good because he made woman to be a woman. And you should not step away from what God says, but you should press into it. Because that's where true flourishing happens. The battle that's occurring is, do we listen to the magicians or don't we? So, yes, sir.
I just wanted to add an extra unfortunate step in that ladder. I would say, I can't guarantee when, but at some point in time in the last maybe 20 years, there has become a radical feminization within the church itself. Now, people are going to argue with that all you want. A lot of the music is about feelings. And that really, for most part, geared towards women. A lot of the worship songs, modern worship, I'm not saying the old hymns.
Yeah.
A lot of modern worship, and a lot of women, they like, they fall in love with his boyfriend, Jesus, she's my husband, and all this other stuff. You know, you hear this stuff, you just hear it, and you say,
yeah.
It's not even biblical, and you pretended to be a Christian or saying you are. You got all that. And women pastors, and then of course you have the United Methodist Church, which is split because of the homosexual.
Yep.
So, and these things right in the pulpit.
Yep.
That is where a lot of this church needs to start. The pulpit needs to be preaching the gospel message.
Yep.
The truth of Christ.
Yeah, it all starts with preaching the gospel. Because what the reality is Satan wants men and women to hate each other. Because if men and women hate each other, then we all fight, and we all kill each other, and then we all destroy everything. Because when you're just trying to burn everything down, guess what? Everything gets burned down. But when you say, hey, here's what God says, and it's good, and here's what's good about being a woman, and honorable and wonderful and amazing, and the same for men, things happen that are good because you obeyed God. Well, it's right around 8, so we can land the plane here. Next week, we are going to talk about flies. The plague is flies. So come back for some more Egyptian mythology and cultural connection, and most importantly, Bible study.